Welcome in, everyone. We're kicking off a brand new series here, something we're calling Navigating Maternal Mental Health.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, thanks. It's brought to you by Fundamental Foundations Counseling Center in Little Elm, Texas. And for our very first deep dive in this series, we're tackling a subject that can be, well, kind of heavy, but it's so important. We're talking about postpartum PTSD.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those things that a lot of folks don't realize how common it is.
Right. And we've got a ton of great information to unpack today. We'll be looking at, what postpartum PTSD actually is. What are some of the signs? What might cause it? And how is it different from postpartum depression, which is something we hear a lot more about? And, most importantly, we really want to leave everyone with a sense of hope. Because the good news is there are effective treatments out there and recovery is possible.
Yeah, and I think, even just starting with that definition of what postpartum PTSD is, there's already some really interesting stuff in the research you've pulled together.
Definitely. So, based on what we've been reading, it seems like postpartum PTSD is a mental health condition that can develop after childbirth. But the thing is, it's not just about the birth itself being difficult. It's about a traumatic experience that happened at any point before, during, or even shortly after the birth.
And that's something that I think, people maybe don't always consider. It's not just like, oh, was there a medical emergency during the delivery? It's about the mother's perception, her experience of the whole thing. It can be real or perceived trauma.
hmm
And that's a really crucial point because it means that her feelings and her reactions are valid regardless of what, anyone else might have observed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's not about judging whether or not something was objectively traumatic. It's about how it was experienced by the mother and how that experience impacts her mental health.
Exactly. And, sometimes those experiences, they can really linger.
So let's talk about that. What are some of the telltale signs of postpartum PTSD? Like, how does it show up?
So the research points to this, like this persistent state of anxiety. It's almost like a constant danger signal going off in the brain. It's this feeling of being on edge, of never really feeling safe.
Wow.
And like other forms of PTSD, flashbacks, or intrusive memories of that traumatic event are really common.
And those aren't just, kind of fleeting thoughts, are they?
No, not at all. It can be like reliving the experience, like it's happening all over again. Very vivid, very distressing.
Yeah.
And that piece of it, I think, is one of the things that really sets it apart from, say, postpartum depression, which is something we hear a lot more about.
Right. And it is important to remember, isn't it, that these are separate conditions.
Yes, absolutely.
Although they can sometimes occur together, which I imagine can make things even more complicated.
Oh, for sure.
So when we're thinking about, is this postpartum depression or is this something else, what are some key differences we should be aware of?
Well, one of the biggest differences, and this is something all the research emphasizes, is the root cause. Postpartum PTSD is directly linked to that traumatic experience during or around the birth. But with postpartum depression, it's usually this complex mix of things: hormonal shifts, stress, new responsibilities, the huge life change that becoming a parent is.
That makes sense. And because
Yeah.
the causes are different, the symptoms also look different, right?
Exactly. With postpartum PTSD, you see a lot of what we just talked about, those intrusive memories, the hypervigilance, avoidance of anything that might trigger those memories,
Mhm.
and often this feeling of being emotionally numb or detached.
So it's really centered around the trauma itself.
Exactly. Whereas with postpartum depression, it's more about, overwhelming sadness, crying a lot, losing interest in things you used to enjoy, changes in appetite and sleep, and often feelings of guilt or worthlessness, maybe struggling to connect with the baby.
And I'm guessing that because the causes and symptoms are different, the treatment approaches are also different.
Yes, that's right. But it's really important to emphasize here, and this is a message that comes through loud and clear in everything we've read. Both postpartum PTSD and postpartum depression are serious. They can really impact a mother's well-being and her ability to care for her baby, but both are treatable, especially if we catch them early.
So early intervention is key.
Absolutely.
Now, let's dive into some of those symptoms of postpartum PTSD in a bit more detail, because I think what's striking from the research is that the symptoms can manifest in ways that people might not immediately connect with trauma.
Right, and it can be easy to miss or misinterpret what's going on.
So what are some of those maybe less obvious signs?
Well, one of the defining characteristics is this re-experiencing of the trauma. It can happen over and over, and it's often uncontrollable. And we've already talked about flashbacks and nightmares, but it can also show up as these intrusive memories that just pop into your head, or even physical sensations that are linked to the trauma, like your heart starts racing, or you feel like you can't breathe.
Right, it's like your body is remembering, and then there are the triggers.
Oh, yeah. And triggers can be anything. It can
Yeah.
be a certain smell, a sound, a place, even just a word or a phrase that someone says. And it can bring back those intense feelings and sensations of the trauma.
And that's why avoidance is so common, right?
Exactly. People will try to avoid anything that might remind them of the trauma. They might not want to talk about it. They might stay away from certain places or people. And in some cases, they might even try to avoid thinking about the experience altogether.
Which I imagine is really difficult to do.
It can be incredibly challenging, and it can really start to impact your life. And then there's that hypervigilance that we talked about earlier.
So it's like being constantly on guard.
Exactly. It's that feeling that something bad is going to happen. And it can make it really hard to relax or to feel safe. You're jumpy, you're easily startled. The world feels dangerous. And then there are I guess what we might think of as the less obvious symptoms.
Like what?
Well, feelings of detachment, feeling disconnected from your own body and emotions, feeling like you're not really present. And that can extend to other people too, even your own baby.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this is something the sources really highlighted. This can be really difficult for new mothers because there's this expectation that you're going to feel this instant bond, this overwhelming love. But when you're dealing with trauma, that's not always the reality.
And I'm guessing it can make it even harder to seek help.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much shame and guilt associated with these feelings. Like, I should be happy. I should be bonding with my baby. But the truth is, trauma can really mess with those natural instincts.
And I'm also seeing here in the research that anxiety and panic attacks are really common.
Yeah, they go hand in hand with that hypervigilance and that constant sense of threat. And then, you've got the sleep problems, the difficulty concentrating, memory issues. And if you were already struggling with anxiety or depression before the birth, those can become even worse.
So it can really compound existing mental health challenges.
It can.
Yeah.
And then, sometimes there are physical symptoms too. Headaches, stomach aches, things like that, which, can be another way that trauma can manifest.
Yeah.
It's not just all in your head. It can affect your whole body.
Right. It really highlights that mind-body connection.
Absolutely.
And, one of the things that our research talks about is this common misconception that PTSD is something that mainly affects soldiers or first responders. But the numbers tell a very different story.
Right. And those numbers are really eye-opening. Over 30% of women might experience some PTSD symptoms after childbirth, and somewhere between 3% and 9% might develop full-blown postpartum PTSD. So we're talking about a significant portion of new mothers.
And yet it still feels like something that's not talked about very much.
And there are a lot of reasons for that. I think some of it is just a lack of awareness, both among new mothers themselves and among healthcare providers.
You might not recognize the symptoms.
Right. They might not connect the dots between the birth experience and what's happening later on. And then on the mother's side, there's often this fear of judgment, this feeling of shame.
Like, I should be happy. Why am I feeling this way?
Exactly. And so they suffer in silence.
Which makes it even more important for us to be talking about it, to raise awareness.
Absolutely.
So let's shift gears a bit and talk about what causes postpartum PTSD. Our research does a good job of breaking down the different types of events that can be traumatic.
Yeah, so when we think about PTSD in general, the root cause is always some kind of traumatic experience, something that overwhelms your coping mechanisms, leaving a lasting impact on your brain and nervous system. And when we're talking about postpartum PTSD, those traumatic experiences are specifically related to pregnancy, labor, delivery, or that immediate postpartum period.
Right, so anything that happens in that whole time frame can potentially be a trigger.
Exactly. And some of the common examples that our sources point to are things like really difficult or prolonged labors, especially if there's a lot of pain.
It makes sense that that could be traumatic.
Yeah, and the use of instruments like forceps or a vacuum during delivery.
Oh, wow.
Emergency C-sections can also be really traumatic, especially if it wasn't something that the mother was expecting or prepared for.
Right, because it's such a sudden change of plans. And then there are those situations where the mother or baby's health is at risk.
Yeah, like if the umbilical cord prolapses or the baby's heart rate drops, anything that feels like a life or death situation.
That must be incredibly terrifying.
It is. And one of the sources even included a story from Mummer who said that the moment her baby's heart rate dropped, she felt this wave of terror wash over her, and that feeling stuck with her, even though the baby ended up being fine.
So it's not just the outcome, it's the experience itself.
Exactly. And sometimes, even when the birth itself goes relatively smoothly, there can be things that happen afterwards that are traumatic.
Like what?
Well, things like severe postpartum hemorrhage
Yeah.
or needing a hysterectomy. Preeclampsia or eclampsia can be traumatic too.
And of course, there's the emotional and psychological side of things.
Right. So one of the things that came up a lot in the research was this sense of feeling unsupported or unheard during labor and delivery, like
Mm.
not having your concerns addressed
Yeah.
or feeling like you don't have a say in what's happening to your own body.
Wow, I can see how that would be really disempowering.
It can be.
Mm.
And those feelings of powerlessness, of not being in control, can contribute to that sense of trauma. And it's important to remember, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some of the more common examples.
Mhm.
But any experience that a mother perceives as traumatic can potentially lead to postpartum PTSD.
And that's a really important point. It's all about the individual's experience.
Exactly.
Now, not everyone who has a difficult or challenging birth experience develops postpartum PTSD. So our sources also talk about risk factors.
Right, because it's a complex interplay of different things.
So what are some of the factors that might make someone more vulnerable?
Well, one of the biggest ones is a history of previous trauma. So things like sexual assault, abuse, domestic violence, or even a serious accident. Those experiences can make you more susceptible to developing PTSD later on.
Because your system is already sensitized to trauma.
Exactly. And if you've had PTSD symptoms before, even if it was from a completely different event, that also increases your risk.
So it's like your brain is already wired for that kind of response.
Right. And then there are things like pre-existing anxiety, depression, or other mental health challenges.
Which again makes sense.
And then there are the social factors. Like if you don't have a strong support system, if you're feeling isolated or alone, that can make you more vulnerable.
So having people you can rely on, people you can talk to is really protective.
It is. And then, unfortunately, negative experiences with healthcare providers can also be a risk factor.
Oh, that's so sad.
It is. And it really underscores the importance of compassionate, trauma-informed care during pregnancy and childbirth.
Because those experiences can stay with you.
They can. And, one more thing to mention about risk factors is that anything that reminds you of the trauma, anything that triggers those feelings of anxiety or fear, can actually make your PTSD symptoms worse.
So it's not just about the initial event, it's about the ongoing triggers.
Exactly. Which is why it's so important to get help, to learn how to manage those triggers, and to process the trauma. And that brings us to a really important distinction that I think a lot of people get confused about. The difference between postpartum PTSD and postpartum depression.
Right. Because they're often talked about together, but they're not the same thing.
They're not. And understanding the differences is really crucial for getting the right kind of help. So to recap, with postpartum PTSD, the trigger is that traumatic experience during or around childbirth.
Whereas with postpartum depression, it's more about those hormonal shifts, the stress, the adjustment to parenthood.
Exactly. And the symptoms also look different. With postpartum PTSD, it's those intrusive memories, the flashbacks, the hypervigilance, the avoidance. It's really all about that trauma response.
Whereas with postpartum depression, it's more about that deep sadness, the low mood, the loss of interest in things you used to enjoy.
Right. And the treatments are also different. Postpartum PTSD is usually treated with trauma-focused therapies, whereas postpartum depression might involve talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and sometimes medication. But the key takeaway here is that both conditions are serious, both can impact your life and your ability to care for your baby. But both are treatable, especially with early intervention.
So there's hope.
There absolutely is.
And speaking of hope, our research also talks about the prognosis for postpartum PTSD.
Yeah, and the good news is the outlook is actually quite positive with the right treatment. Now, the duration of symptoms can vary depending on a lot of things, how severe the trauma was, how intense the symptoms are, how quickly you get help. But with timely and appropriate intervention, things can often improve significantly.
So it doesn't have to be a life sentence.
No, it doesn't. But it's important to acknowledge that if it's left untreated, postpartum PTSD can have a really long-term impact on your life. It can affect your relationships, your ability to work, your ability to care for yourself and your child. It can even increase your risk of developing other mental health conditions.
So getting help is crucial.
It is. And there are things that can really improve the prognosis. Getting professional help early on is huge.
Makes sense.
Having a strong support system, family, friends, partners, that makes a world of difference.
Those people you can lean on.
Exactly. And then taking care of yourself, eating well, getting enough sleep, exercising, finding healthy ways to manage stress. And then, of course, ongoing support and management can make a big difference in the long run.
So it's not just about that initial treatment phase, it's about having ongoing support.
Right. And it's also important to remember that relapse is possible. So staying aware of your triggers, knowing the warning signs, and having a plan in place in case symptoms start to creep back up, that can be really helpful.
So it's kind of an ongoing process.
It can be. But the good news is, with the right support and treatment, people can and do recover from postpartum PTSD.
That's so encouraging to hear. And speaking of treatment, let's talk about some of the specific approaches that our sources highlighted as being effective.
Yeah, so the gold standard for treating postpartum PTSD is trauma-focused psychotherapy.
And there are a few different types of therapy that fall under that umbrella, right?
That's right. And the sources specifically mention cognitive behavioral therapy, which is often just called CBT, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR. And then there's prolonged exposure therapy and narrative exposure therapy.
And these are all specialized therapies, right?
They are. And they're typically provided by licensed mental health professionals who have specific training in trauma-informed care, which basically means that they understand the impact of trauma and they know how to work with it in a way that's safe and effective.
So it's not just about talking about the trauma, it's about processing it in a way that helps you heal.
Exactly. And the goals of these therapies are to help you understand and process the trauma, to reduce those distressing symptoms, and to improve your overall well-being. And in addition to therapy, medication can sometimes be helpful too.
Especially if the symptoms are really severe.
Right. And the most common types of medications that are used are antidepressants, specifically a class called SSRIs.
And those are often used to treat depression and anxiety too, right?
There you are. And some of the common ones that you might hear about are Zoloft, Prozac, Paxil. But it's really important to talk to your doctor before starting any medication, especially if you're breastfeeding.
Because some medications can pass through breast milk?
Exactly. And then there's another class of medications called benzodiazepines, which are anti-anxiety medications.
And those are things like Xanax and Valium, right?
That's right. And those could be helpful for short-term use, but they do have some potential side effects and risks. So it's really important to use them only as prescribed by your doctor.
So the bottom line is, if you're struggling with postpartum PTSD, reach out for help.
Absolutely. There are effective treatments available, and you don't have to suffer in silence. And actually, Fundamental Foundation's Counseling Center in Little Elm, Texas, offers a lot of these therapies that we've been talking about: EMDR, narrative therapy, CBT, and they also have medication management services. And they have this whole series, Navigating Maternal Mental Health, which is really fantastic.
Well, that's a great resource to share.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about what postpartum PTSD is, how it shows up, what might cause it, how it's different from postpartum depression, and most importantly, the fact that it's treatable.
And that there is hope.
Absolutely. Recovery is possible. And, one of the things that really struck me from all the information we looked at was just how common postpartum PTSD is.
Yeah, it really is much more common than people realize. And it can affect anyone.
And yet it's still something that we don't talk about enough.
Right. And that's why conversations like this are so important, because the more we talk about it, the more we normalize it, the less stigma there will be. And the more likely it is that women will feel comfortable reaching out for help.
Exactly. And, as we wrap things up, I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts for our listeners. Like, what's one thing they can take away from this conversation and maybe even put into action?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that postpartum PTSD is real, it's treatable, and no one has to go through it alone. And if there's one thing I would encourage our listeners to do, it would be to think about the new mothers in their own lives, their friends, their family members, their colleagues, and just check in with them. Ask how they're doing, really listen to their answers, and offer support without judgment. Because sometimes that simple act of reaching out can make all the difference.
That's a beautiful sentiment. And on that note, we'll wrap things up for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into postpartum PTSD. We'll be back next time with another important topic in our Navigating Maternal Mental Health series. Until then, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.
See you next time.